Allora, benvenuti, salve a tutti, benvenuti al nostro secondo incontro, questo seminario sul tema Oriente-Occidente nel pensiero moderno tra 8 e 900. E questa volta il relatore oggi sarà il professor Christian Lange, ancora dell'Università di Utrecht, professore di Islamic Studies a Utrecht, il grande esperto, diciamo, della tradizione arabo-islamica. Ha pubblicato un importante libro for Cambridge University, per Cambridge University Press, sulle nozioni di inferno e paradiso nel pensiero islamico. Adesso si sta occupando, diciamo, dei sensi nel mondo islamico da un punto di vista letterario, filosofico, antropologico, e oggi ci presenta il tema, la relazione di oggi è dedicata al tema mito e sensibilità nel pensiero arabo del XIX secolo. Gli passo la parola e poi dopo, come al solito, ci sarà tempo per discutere con lui.
Perfetto, grazie Mauro. Thank you for coming. Turn on the microphone. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some preliminary thoughts with you on the history of myth and sensibility in the exchange between Europe and the Near East in the 19th century, which is part of a larger project that I'm currently running on the history of the senses, literally the 5 senses of the human body. So protocols of seeing, listening, tasting, and so on. So let me begin with a question. When studying 19th century Arab and maybe more broadly speaking, Middle Eastern views of myth and sensibility, what is at stake? This one, maybe? I thought it was this one.
Did you choose the right one?
Yes.
We just try to start again.
Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so back to my question. What is at stake? Now, I think the only way to tackle this question is by looking at it through the prism of Middle Eastern societies' encounter with Western colonial modernity, which is an encounter, as I'm sure you all know, that had a massive impact on Middle Eastern life, politics, economy, social organization, but also intellectually in the arts, in education, and in higher education. So what is at stake? I think one quick answer to this question is to show you this image, which is by the French Orientalist painter Delacroix, and is entitled The Death of Sardanapalus, painted in 1827. So roughly at the beginning of the colonial enterprise, European colonial enterprise in the Middle East. What do you see depicted here? You see Sardanapalus, the king, a Syrian king, at the moment when he's told that the army of a conquering empire, the Babylonians, is about to conquer his city and dethrone him. And what does he do? He tells his palace guards to kill all the women in the harem. Okay, and it's very drastically depicted, I think. I mean, it's tending towards a kind of pornographic depiction, I would say. So I highlighted the detail, and probably that wasn't even necessary. You see, this violence that is done here is quite extreme. So this image, to my mind, kind of sums up a Western idea of Oriental sensualism. Orientals are depicted here as hypersexual, hypersensual, addicted to the pleasure of the senses, and this is epitomized by the figure of the Sultan, in this case, or the king or the Dey, presiding over his harem. including everything that the harem invokes: seduction, intrigue, also jealousy, violence. Terrible triad of sex, violence, and irrationality. Think of the fact that this king Sardanapalus here is depicted at the moment when a foreign empire is going to conquer his own empire. In the context of the beginning colonial expansion in the Middle East, I think this was a very clear message to European publics that this is about, kind of to happen in reality. So we are liberating the Orientals from this strangely sexual sensualism. Now, when we study this kind of pictures, and I'm going to show you quite a bit of these pictures, so prepare yourselves. When we study these pictures and representations also in literature, you will need kind of theoretical framework to approach the topic. And I think it's impossible to talk about this topic without invoking the name and the work of Edward Said. I don't know if you are familiar with Edward Said. He wrote a very famous work of literary criticism and intellectual history, which is the beginning, some say, of post-colonial studies in 1979, called Orientalism. Here you see the first edition of this work, and it has an image or a painting of another Orientalist painter on the cover, this time by Jérôme. The painting is called The Snake Charmer. So in this book, what Said does is he analyzes and he unmasks the ideological foundations of Western colonial hegemony over the East in the 19th century, and in particular, the Arab Middle East. He looks at the writings of mostly English and French Orientalists, and by Orientalists, what he means is both academics, that is scholars of Islam and of the Middle East, but also artists and actually mostly novelists. He talks a lot about novelists. So he analyzes these works and then he juxtaposes these Orientalist depictions with the ideas expressed by the agents, politicians and administrators of the European colonial empires. Very powerful analysis that he proposes and very influential. Now, the question of Oriental sensualism is touched on by Said in a couple of places in Orientalism. It's arguably not the main topic of the work, but he makes several pertinent observations, and I'd like to share them with you here. According to Said, Orientalists describe the Orient, and I quote, as feminine, its riches as fertile, its main symbols the sensual woman, the harem, and the despotic but curiously attractive ruler. So harem is an important topic here, and images of the harem and of women in the harem, always naked, always white-skinned, were often painted by 19th century European painters. This starts roughly with the French painter Ingres, who in as early as, 1808, had painted this back view of a naked woman. There's nothing Oriental here yet, but he takes this motif and applies it to scenes of Oriental harems in later paintings. So you see this later painting of 1863, which is an exact copy. And then Jérôme, whom I had already introduced to you, remember he was the painter of the Snake Charmer on the cover of Said's book. He takes this famous back of the naked harem woman. He flips it around, you see, horizontally, but it's the same motif. Ingres also famously painted the other picture that you see here, the lying harem slave, again, very white. And this also comes up in later European Orientalist paintings quite a bit. As for literature, so this is the paintings. As for literature, and here on the cover of this book, you'll see the Ingres lying figure, right? As for literature, Said draws attention to the 1828 English pornographic novel, The Lustful Turk. This is the story of two English women abducted by North African corsairs, pirates, and raped repeatedly by the Dey of Algiers in his harem. Said states that much of the scholarship on the Orient, and I quote him, comes out of the same impulse, he says, the impulse of portraying Oriental despots and Orientals in general as driven by lust and extreme sensualism. What is going on here? Said explains the reasons for this with the following. He says, for 19th century Europe, with its increasing embourgeoisement, sex had been institutionalized to a very considerable degree. The Orient, by contrast, was a place where one could look for sexual experience unobtainable in Europe. Virtually no European writer who wrote on or traveled to the Orient in the period after 1800 exempted himself or herself from this quest. Flaubert, Nerval, Dirty Dick Burton, and Lane are only the most notable. And I want you to retain the two names of Burton, Dirty Dick Burton, and Lane, because I'll return to them later in my talk. In reading about Western fantasies of the East, it's fruitful to compare Said's work with the work of Alain Gros-Richard, La structure du sérail, also published in 1979. There's an English translation, The Sultan's Court. Gros-Richard talks primarily about the fiction of Oriental despotism. He's interested in this Sultan figure, the Caliph. He talks mostly about the Ottoman Empire, and his analysis is based on European literature of the 17th and 18th century, philosophers like Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire, but also travelers. Whereas Said's approach is Foucauldian, you might say, or Marxist in a broad sense, Gros-Richard's approach is psychoanalytical. He focuses on the notion of jouissance, or enjoyment of the Oriental despot. The Oriental despot, as depicted in this literature, is a figure of insatiable lust, not only for sex, but also for goods and things. And this reflects jouissance. Quoting a little bit from Gros-Richard, he says, I quote, the order of the seraglio, which is the harem, is organized for the purpose and the practice of the despot's jouissance. The seraglio appears as a complex apparatus built from start to finish in order to suck from outside it and everywhere beyond it all that has worth as an object of jouissance, in order to purify it, load it to its greatest potency, and stockpile it. So he's writing this, of course, with the critical intention to unmask and deconstruct these fantasies. So you could say that both Said and Gros-Richard thoroughly debunked Western or European fantasies and stereotypes about the sensual Islamic Orient. But neither replaced the fantasy or the stereotype with an account of the emic perspective, that is, of the indigenous understandings of the senses and of sensation. Both Gros-Richard and Said remain within a hermeneutics of critique, not one of understanding. And it's only recently that scholars have started to look at the other side of the story. This is a very good example, really one of the, I think, the best book on the topic so far, by Joseph Massad, Desiring Arabs, published in 2007. Massad is a prominent Jordanian academic, a professor of Middle East studies at Columbia University, and a student of Said. So this study of Massad is focused on 19th and 20th century Arab understandings of sex and desire, male desires and homoerotic desire in particular. So there are two things that he describes. One thing is that many Arab intellectuals of the 19th century actually bought into Orientalist stereotypes. They reproduced them. But there are also others that spoke back to the colonialist ideology of Orientalism and tried to carve out a space for resisting Western norms and categorizations. I'll quote it just a little bit from Massad's conclusion. He says that Arab intellectuals of the 19th and 20th centuries were engaged in, and I quote, an elaboration, so kind of reproducing, but also an occasional contestation of the place of sexual desires in wider discourses and practices of modernity. It is at these rarer moments when the imposition and seduction of Western norms fail that the possibility of different conceptions of desires, politics, and subjectivities emerge. So in the rest of my talk, this was my introductory remarks. In the rest of my talk, I will try to combine both the insights and approaches of Said and Gros-Richard on the one hand and of Massad on the other hand. And I will present 3 case studies to you. The first one is the Muslim Paradise. The second one is the 1001 Nights. And the third one is the Arabic literary erotica tradition. So for each of these case studies, I will first introduce you to Western Orientalist fantasies a la Gros-Richard and discourses of power a la Said. And then secondly, I will talk about the kind of responses and reactions that these discourses elicited among Arab writers and intellectuals a la Massad. So case study 1, the Islamic Paradise. This is actually kind of Dionysian myth, you might say, and perhaps here I connect with Paul's wonderful talk of yesterday, which was about myth. I'm talking much more about sensibility, as you've gathered already, I think. Now, anyway, the point I want to make is that there is a very long history of European polemics against the Islamic paradise. In Islamic studies, there is a classic study on the history of polemics against Islam by Norman Daniel, Islam and the West, the Making of an Image, where Daniel writes the following: "It was the Islamic paradise which, more than any other theme, summed up the Christian notion of Islam. It was always thought to prove the contention that this was no spiritual religion." No spiritual religion, but rather, I'm adding, a sensual and irrational one. In 1870, this painting was exhibited in the most important exhibition venue for painting in Paris, the Salon. It's called Le Rêve du Croyant, so the dream of the dreamer, and its creator is a painter called Achille Zo, who was director of the École des Beaux-Arts in Bordeaux, so not a minor figure by any means. He was a well-known artist at the time. What you see here, you see an old Arab man lying in the corner, dreaming of the Islamic paradise, in which there are many naked women running around, as you can see. There's music and jouissance. The women that are depicted here are often referred to in the literature as houris. I don't know if you're familiar with the term houri. It originates in the Quran. There are Islamic traditions, the Quran included, that speak of female servants to the male inhabitants of paradise. So he's taking this theme here and running with it. Also note, by the way, it's a detail perhaps, that he's smoking a shisha. If you look at the right bottom corner, there is perhaps an insinuation that he's not only smoking tobacco here, but something more. There are many paintings of opium consumers. The Orientalist, that was one of the favorite scenes painted by Orientalist painters. So the effeminate Oriental, sitting on his couch and smoking opium or eating opium and dreaming of women. So there's actually a paradox here. On the one hand, you have the super sensual, hypersexual paradise, but you also have the effeminate, kind of castrated Arab men who can only dream about it, but not do more. So what kind of reactions did this portrayal of the Islamic paradise and of Muslim men elicit in the writings of Arab writers? Now, I'll take a little detour to approach this question. I will introduce you to a famous Arab visitor to Paris of the 19th century, the Egyptian religious scholar Rifa'at at-Tahtawi. This at-Tahtawi was in Paris from 1826 to 1830 as a member of a group of students that were sent by the ruler of Egypt, Mehmed Ali, to study the newest sciences of the Europeans. And when he returned to Egypt, this is very famous in Egypt and in other Arab contexts, when he returned to Egypt, he wrote a famous work in which he described the manners of the Parisians, translated into English much later as An Imam in Paris. The French, in at-Tahtawi's view, are scandalously licentious and excessively sensual, materialist, and desire-driven. He says this: among the traits of the French is they're spending money on the needs of the soul and on satanic desires. They're playing games as they are extremely extravagant. When he says soul here, he's not thinking of a spiritual, religious entity. This is the lower soul, the soul that is responsible for passions and desires. At-Tahtawi zooms in on the behavior of women and women-men relations in particular. He says, among the worst traits of the French is the dearth of chastity among many of their women and the lack of jealousy among their men. They treat unlawful sexual relations, especially with regards to the unmarried men, merely as a vice and a shame, but not as sin. Generally speaking, this city, that is Paris, like the rest of the great cities of the Europeans, is charged with abominations, reprehensible innovations, and temptations, even though in other respects the city of Paris is the French Athens. Now let me bring paradise back into this picture, and for this meet this gentleman, Ahmad Faris Ashidyaq, a scholar writer from Lebanon. He was born into one of the Oriental Christian churches, the Maronite Church, but then in the 1830s converted to Protestantism when in Cairo. Later he moved to England and Paris, where he lived in the 1840s and 1850s. In 1860, in Tunisia, he converted to Islam. And he passed away in Istanbul in 1887. Very colorful, well-traveled man, considered to be one of the most important figures of the Arabic literary renaissance of the 19th century, the so-called Nahda, the Nahda. I'll mention this several times. His opus magnum is a sprawling novel entitled Leg Over Leg. It was first published in Arabic in Paris in 1855. It's a novel that tells the story of a picaresque Arab hero and traveler, really the alter ego of Ashidyaq, around the middle of the 19th century. There's a masterful recent translation into English if you're interested. Two passages from Leg Over Leg can serve to illustrate how, from a Middle Easterner's perspective, sensual excess was not so much something belonging to the Muslims or to the Muslim paradise, but rather to modern European society. Here's a poem from the novel. The pleasures of Paris, I swear, are as those of paradise. Yes, indeedy. And it holds as many houris too. You've already told you about the houris. Here, though, he's referring to Paris, here, though, they are forever being touched. And there are 40 concerts for each man to woo. Now, this requires a bit of explanation. So he's referring to the houris, and he says, in Paris, they are forever being touched. Is that not the case in Islam? It's not, because the Quran says that the houris are in paradise, but they are untouched. So this is kind of an implicit quotation from the Quran. So French reality beats the Muslim fantasy of paradise. So he's really not trying to compliment the Parisians here. This is very clear in the following quote. He says, the French make no distinction between the respectable woman and the harlot, and all that remains to be said is that no people are more lascivious than they in their desire for intercourse, or more liquorish in their desire for fornication. It is enough to mention that during this great schism that arose in 1793, they put a naked woman on the altar of a church and bowed to her. So this is a reference to the famous worship of the goddess of reason in Notre Dame, right? So Ashidyaq sees in the sexual profligacy of the French the actualization of the sensual paradise of the Muslim imagination. And what this accomplishes, I think, is an ironic reversal of the Western accusation of Oriental sensualism back to the Europeans. So he's saying, it's you who have a problem, not us. We Orientals may have a sensualist imagination, but you Europeans are sensualists in practice. So the case of At-Tahtawi and Ashidyaq demonstrates that one way of countering the Orientalist charge of sensualism was simply to flip the accusation around and replace Orientalism with Occidentalism. This is an argumentative move that runs from the 19th into the 20th century, where it takes a radical turn. Leading Islamist ideologues of the 20th century, like Sayyid Qutb, saw the West, and I'm quoting him here, as the main corrupter of sexual morality. They warned against the licentiousness of Europeans and encouraged, and this is the radical turn, they encouraged their followers to fight it. In 2001, as American forces moved into Afghanistan, a young Taliban fighter on the Pakistan border told a reporter of the Telegraph that the Americans would never win because they love Coca-Cola, but we love death. This phrase, they love Coca-Cola, but we love death, became kind of a slogan of both the Taliban and later the fighters of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And it's a key strategy of the Islamists until today, as Ian Buruma and Avishai Margalit have noted in a study that is titled Occidentalism. It's a key strategy of these Islamists to portray the West as, I quote, soft and sickly, a decadent civilization addicted to pleasure. So you see, I'm drifting off into the 20th and even the 21st century. So let me return to the 19th century and let me move on to my second case study. The 1001 Nights. 19th century European Orientalists loved the 1001 Nights, le mille e una notte, as the Italians call them. In the following, I will simply refer to them as the Nights. The Nights have an interesting history in Europe and in the Arab world. In 1701, a Frenchman, Antoine Galland, had discovered a manuscript of the Nights and produced a first partial translation. So not everything, only a very small selection. This translation rose to great prominence in 18th and 19th century Europe. In the 19th century, editions of the various translations, so there were more than one by the time, were often lavishly illustrated. Here you see a couple of examples. Dalziel's illustrated Nights are very famous. Again, you see a kind of harem scene. This is Shehrazad talking to the Caliph. Again, note how she's very white. He's kind of darkish. Dulac's illustrations, produced 40 years later, also became famous. I unfortunately don't have time to go more into this, but it would be very interesting, I think, to pick apart the iconology of these images. Now, roughly 100 years after Galland, the French first translator, an English Orientalist called Edward William Lane produced the classic Victorian translation into English. Lane was mentioned in the quote by Said that I gave you. I told you to remember two names, right? Lane and Dirty Dick Burton. So here's Lane. This translation was published in 1840 in 3 very stately volumes. You see him here on the slide posing in Oriental dress. That's a photograph taken around 1845. In addition to his translation of the Nights, he wrote 2 famous works, Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians, and an Arabic-English lexicon, a dictionary, which is still used very much today. I have a copy of it on my desk home in Utrecht. In Manners and Customs, Lane writes that the heat in Egypt excites the Egyptian to intemperance in sensual enjoyments. And yet, in his translation of the Nights, Lane behaved quite prudishly because he excised stories and incidents with erotic content. And should you be unaware, the Nights are full of erotic stories. So European readers had to wait until the appearance of Dirty Dick Burton for a translation that tried to do justice to the undeniable sensualism of the Nights. Here's Dirty Dick Burton. This is Richard Francis Burton, a celebrated English traveler and writer. Among other exploits, he visited Mecca in disguise and famously participated in an expedition in search of the source of the Nile. On the slide, you see him looking quite the manly, intrepid explorer. His mausoleum in North London is built in the shape of a Bedouin tent. He was by all standards an extravagant character and a larger-than-life figure. There are novels that have been written about him, and also quite good ones, including this one by Ilya Troyanov, translated into Italian from the German as Il collezionista di mondi. Now, Burton produced a multi-volume translation, 10 volumes, and 6 supplementary volumes. A multi-volume translation of the Nights that was published in 1885. In his foreword, he made it clear that he was really unhappy with Lane's translation. He writes in his foreword that Lane and other translators degraded a chef d'oeuvre of the highest anthropological and ethnographical interest and importance to a mere fairy book, a nice present for little boys. And this is how maybe many of us got to know the Nights. I mean, I got to know it as a little boy, and yeah, it seemed a fairy book. So Burton has a point here. He says that, by contrast, Burton, will present the true Nights. The Nights, he explains, have helped him, Burton, to understand the sensuous, and I'm quoting him, the sensuous context in which Oriental culture finds itself. However, in his translation, he goes to the opposite extreme of Lane. It's not for nothing that he's, nicknamed Dirty Dick Burton. So not only does he keep the sex scenes in, but he exaggerates them. And he adds extensive learned notes on such matters as homosexuality, bestiality, and castration. Now, let me flip the picture again and talk about the reception of the Nights in the 19th century Near and Middle East. In the Arab and also the Persian world, the Nights were traditionally considered a rather insignificant text. People thought that it was kind of mid-level or popular literature. It wasn't really taken seriously. It's true there are a lot of manuscripts of the Nights, more than 500, which makes it very difficult to translate and edit the text. But for example, none of them were illustrated, and they are all quite different. So the impression you get is that this is kind of a chaotic corpus that grew in different directions without anybody really bothering. New stories kept getting added, other stories were changed or completely discarded. So in pre-colonial times, the Nights were certainly not considered as the emblematic Arabic text that they have become in colonial times, in Europe, but also, as I will tell you, among Arab readers. There are 4 19th century Arabic printed editions of the Nights. Scholars have suggested that the main classic Arabic edition of the Nights in the 19th century, this is what you see here on the slide, the Cairo edition of 1835, was motivated first and foremost by economic interest. The Arab editors knew that if they put this out, a lot of European customers would buy the Nights. But there's also something here that heralds the new interest and the appreciation of the Nights in the Arab world. So let me now introduce you to some reactions to the Nights. And I'll begin with this gentleman, Georgi Zaidan. Zaidan, like Ashidyaq, was a Lebanese author and intellectual. He's another of these very important figures in the Arabic Nahda, the Renaissance of literature in the 19th century. He wrote many historical novels, more than 20. And these historical novels of Zaidan are clearly inspired by the Nights. They use the Nights' historical settings, the medieval Islamic city, the desert, the caliphal palace, including the harem. Zaidan writes stories about the seclusion of women in the harem, which for him, the harem is a kind of symbol of the idleness and the sensualism of the Middle East. So he more or less reproduces the fantasy of the Oriental despot's harem that Gros Richard has traced to the likes of Montesquieu and Voltaire. In essence, Zaidan is saying that the Nights illustrate what is wrong with Middle Eastern societies. So he seems to be saying, we've got a problem with sensualism. It's a symptom of our political decadence and of despotism, and we need to address it and do something about it. So this is kind of a political attitude that buys into Orientalist discourse. A variant of this attitude towards the Nights stresses the aspect of moral and religious decadence, especially in regard to female sexuality. One of the famous Nahda journals is the journal Al-Hilal, published in Egypt since 1892 and actually all the way to the present day. The founding editor of Al-Hilal was no other than Georgi Zaidan. There's an issue in 1901 in Al-Hilal in which we find an article about the Nights, and I'll quote from this article here. The Nights, this article says, have been published numerous times and translated into most European languages. It is one of the most beautiful books of customs and traditions. However, in it there are terms and words that would make cultured men feel embarrassed, not to mention modest women. And we are now in an age where both sexes are reading literary books. Able scholars in Beirut, therefore, have addressed this problem and have abridged it and have published it twice. It has undergone a thorough abridgment so that no modest woman could be embarrassed by reading it. Unquote. So this article, as you see, cautions Arab readers, women in particular, they must be protected against the embarrassing excesses, the sensual excesses, that is, of the tales. So again, the Nights are taken to illustrate something wrong with Middle Eastern societies. Here, however, the problem is not so much political, but rather moral and religious. And it concerns not just the despot, but all of Near Eastern society. But there's also, again, something like the seed of something different, a recognition of the beauty of the Nights. Maybe the beginnings of a tendency to celebrate and to reclaim the Nights. In the course of the 20th century, as the Middle East slowly and painfully emancipated itself politically from European colonial domination, the Nights came to occupy a place of increasing cultural value for readerships in the Arab and Persian-speaking world. So especially in the 20th century, the Nights came to be held up as the sign of Eastern literary genius, and this is maybe how many of us also think about them. Certainly many Muslim writers, Near Eastern, Middle Eastern writers, intellectuals today look at it this way. So they proclaim that the Nights is us, it's our identity, our literary heritage, and it's something to be proud of. Again, I've strayed ahead into the 20th century. Again, let me return to the 19th century and move to my third and final case study. The erotica tradition. Let me introduce you to the two most well-known medieval Arabic erotic texts. They are often talked and thought about in tandem, even if in reality they are quite dissimilar, as you will see in a minute. The first one is called The Ring of the Dove, or in Italian, Il Collare della Colomba. And this is an 11th century text from Muslim Spain by a well-known theologian and literateur called Ibn Hazm. The other one is called The Perfumed Garden, in Italian, Il Giardino Profumato. And this is really an erotic manual written by a certain An-Nafzawi in the 15th century for the vizier at the court of the ruling dynasty in Tunisia, in the 15th century. I find it, and this is why I put this on the slide here, I find it quite amusing that the two Italian editions use the same painting. It's a painting by Ingres. I showed you two of his Oriental scenes, the naked back and the lying odalisque, if you remember. This is another famous one by Ingres. And it appears on both these covers. It's a bit as if editors somehow lack ideas and they can only think of a very limited range of Orientalist paintings when they publish Arabic works that talk about love. Anyway, the dove and the garden, as I will call them, are interesting for historians of the senses because they illustrate two quite different sensory styles, if you like. The dove is a work of love theory, love philosophy. Love in good Platonic fashion is defined by Ibn Hazm, the author of this work, as the union of souls or the union of forms. The sensualism of the dove is rather restrained and refined. And scholars have suggested, for example, that Il collare della colomba, is the root of medieval troubadour notions of courtly love. Sexual libertinism, especially sodomy, is rejected and censored. And of the five senses of the body, it is the sense of sight, of seeing, that is most emphatically stressed in the dove. Here's a short quote. Oh, this is the painting by Ingres, just to prove that I'm not making this up. Here's a quote from The Ring of the Dove. The four senses are open gateways to the heart and windows to the soul. First thing here to notice, of course, is that he's talking about four senses. Why four and not five? Because he leaves touch out, doesn't even enter into the picture. So far away is he from, tactility and sensualism. But sight, Ibn Hazm says, is the most reliable and insightful guide and the one which acts with greatest clarity. So beauty is visually described in the dove. The garden, by contrast, presents a very different case. It is salacious and, you might say, practice-oriented. It provides instructions for successful coition, sex. There's a chapter on aphrodisiaca, a chapter on female and male genitalia. There are very explicit stories about sex and so on and so forth. Everett Rowson, who's a lovely gentleman scholar living in New York, teaches at NYU, is the expert on the Arabic erotica tradition, and he characterizes the garden in these words. He says it's extremely lubricious. It has exceptionally long anecdotes, whose intention is partly humor, but mostly titillation. Reminiscent of parts of the 1001 Nights, but far more obscene than anything in the letter. Now, to give you a passage from the garden directly, here's one. Before coition, the text says, take care to apply perfume, because if both partners use perfume, it is more pleasant to them. Then toy with the woman, excite her with kisses by nibbling and sucking her lips, by caressing her neck and cheeks. So my point here is, I guess, to show that pleasure is related not so much to vision, as in the case of the ring of the dove, but much more importantly to touch, taste, and smell. So now let me talk a little bit about the publication story of the dove and of the garden, and I'll begin with the dove. In Western Orientalism, it was a scholar based in Leiden in the Netherlands, Reinhard Dozy, who first drew attention to the text. Dozy wrote a massive history of the Muslims of Spain, Histoire des Musulmans d'Espagne, which was published in 1861, and there he mentions that there's this text called the Ring of the Dove. He knew of the dove because the only manuscript that exists of the dove is kept in Leiden University Library. It's been there since the 17th century. There's another story to be told, but I don't have time. So Dozy mentions it, but he actually doesn't bother to do much with the text. Edward Said doesn't like Dozy at all. I mean, he doesn't like any of these Orientalists really, but about Dozy he has the following to say. He credits him for his enormous labors, but he also says that his writings display an impressive antipathy to the Orient, Islam, and the Arabs. And it's true that Dozy somehow missed a golden chance here. He just didn't see the point in actually studying the dove. So it took until the 20th century, actually, until 1914 for the first edition of the Arabic text to appear. And the edition was prepared not by an Arab scholar, but by a Russian scholar, D.K. Petrov. Once it was edited in Arabic, it was very quickly published in many different European languages, and ever since the text has been quite famous in Europe. Back to the garden. The text first became known to European readers after the French had gotten to know it in Algeria in the middle of the 19th century, when they were occupying Algeria. A staff officer of the French army in Algeria translated it into French from a manuscript and published this translation in 1853. This is just a few years before Dozy first mentioned Ibn Hazm's dove. Now, Algeria in the middle of the 19th century, I don't know how much you know about it, anything at all. This was the milieu that also produced the well-known picture postcards of naked or semi-naked Algerian women that were then sent home to France by French soldiers. Women on these postcards often wear veils. So they wear veils while their upper bodies are uncovered. They are made to look veiled but available. Now, this has kind of become a phrase in describing these images, veiled but available. And I'm not showing these postcards here because I find them quite offensive in any way. They're easy to find on the internet if you're interested. Now guess who translated the text into English? Any ideas? Dirty Dick Burton. This happened in 1886, shortly before he died. A couple of years earlier, he had also regaled the English reading public with the first English translation of the Kama Sutra. You see a pattern here, I guess. In the introduction, Burton writes about the seriousness with which the most lascivious and obscene matters are presented. A German translation followed in 1905. The oldest Italian translation I could find is from 1924. Now, finally, again, flipping the picture, the Arab view of things. Let me first say a word about the history of erotica literature in the Arab-speaking world, the traditional views of sex and sexuality, if you like, in the Arab Near East. Both the religious and the medical tradition of the Arabic-speaking Islamic world provided human sexuality a natural home. Muslim theologians generally argued that sexual desire is God's gift to humankind, a sign of his grace. Physicians generally couched sexual desire in terms of it being a natural condition. They argued that sexual desire brings the humors of the body, we're operating within a Galenic framework here, it brings the humors of the body out of balance, but there is, they said, a very easy remedy to restore the balance. All you have to do is to consume the desire. So developing on the back of such relatively permissive and, for lack of a better term, liberal attitudes, there's a robust tradition of erotica literature in the Arabic-speaking countries around the Mediterranean Sea. The Garden is one example. This tradition continues, and now comes the clue, and it stops around the middle of the 19th century, which marks the arrival of Western colonialism. In the words again of Everett Rowson, the pursuit of erotic fiction continued unabated in Arabic Ottoman literature until the mid-19th century, when the massive impact of Western colonialism changed all the rules and permanently disrupted the literary tradition. In the previous millennium, Rowson continues, Arabic literature offered a remarkably open, rich, and variegated corpus of erotica, in which religious and ethical considerations, humorous exuberance, sociological analysis, and an unfettered celebration of the power of the word to stimulate both the imagination and the hormones were all given free play. So the reception history of the dove and the garden, I think, only confirms Rowson's description. Take a look at this table with me. So here I've listed, first of all, the number of manuscripts, then the translations into European languages of both texts, and the editions of the Arabic text. So, as I already mentioned, there's only one manuscript of the dove kept in Leiden, while there are around 15, probably more, of the garden. If you skip to the last row, up to the 1950s, there are no Arabic editions of the garden at all. The first Arabic edition, the first time Arab publishers actually bothered to edit the Arabic text of the garden is in 1968 in Tunis. And then the other edition that should be mentioned was made in London in 1993. So interestingly, despite, and it's a different case with the dove. This is the interesting thing. So there was this first edition I mentioned done by a Russian scholar in 1914, but then the Arabs caught on quite quickly in 1931, 1949, and 1950, and more of them. So there was more interest in the dove in the colonial period than in the garden. And this is interesting because the dove, as you can see, there was only one manuscript, whereas there were quite a number of An-Nafsawi's texts. So in pre-modern times, pre-colonial, pre-modern times, the interest for both texts in the Arab world was not enormous, let's put it that way. So the dove was hardly known at all, while the garden enjoyed a moderate popularity. 15 manuscripts is not a massive number either. In colonial times, Arab publishers didn't pick up on the two texts in any way comparable to the great interest the two texts excited in Europe. Among Arab readerships of the two, the dove, which is the less sensual, the far less salacious text, seems to have been more popular, or at least more actively promoted by publishers in the Arab world. It is only in the post-colonial period that the Arabic text is published for the first time. The garden now, in the Arab-speaking world, in Tunis in 1968, the year of love. So this brings us again to the second half, into the 20th century, and even into the second half of the 20th century, and also to my conclusions. I began my talk by tracing the Orientalist trope of the hypersensual, decadent Oriental despot, as well as the Orientalist motif of the Orientals, all Orientals, as being easily aroused, hypersexual peoples governed by the lower senses. Going through 3 case studies with you, I've contrasted this with a variety of Arab attitudes vis-à-vis the question of sensualism and sensual libertinism. A first attitude that simply turns the tables on the Orientalists, claiming that it is the Occidentals who are the true sensualists. Then, from roughly the middle of the 19th century onwards, a second attitude emerges. Under the overwhelming impression of European colonial, economic, cultural, and scientific hegemony in the Near East, Arab intellectuals like Georgi Zaidan now grant that the Orientalist critique of Oriental sensualism is justified. That is, that there really is a problem that needs to be addressed if Near Eastern societies are to overcome their political weakness and their religious and moral decadence. This second attitude fits well with a number of modern reform movements in the Near East. Think of the secular nationalist movements that helped to end European colonialism in the Near East after the Second World War. Think also of movements that seek to purify Islam by focusing on pious asceticism and sense denial, such as Salafism. But also think of Islamism, a movement that actively wants to fight against all forms of libertinism, sensualism, and materialism, whether coming from the West or whether aped by fellow Muslims. It is only in post-colonial times that a third attitude begins to take shape. Arab authors now begin to talk again about the spirit of open sensualism of the early and classical centuries of Islamic history. And they critique the prudishness of modern colonial era reform-oriented Islam. So I will end my talk with presenting 3 examples of Arab thinkers, quite briefly, who wish to reclaim pre-colonial Arab sensualism. In 1975, the year in which the Instituto was founded, that's a strange coincidence, it's also the year in which I was born. Strange. This gentleman, Abdel Wahab Bourdiba, a Tunisian sociologist, published a classic study entitled La sexualité en Islam, in which he argued that, I quote, the sensual ethic experienced by Muslims today and the vision of the world that underlies it have less and less to do with the generous declarations of the Quran and of Muhammad himself. One can even speak of a degradation which began at a very early date of an ideal model. the open sexuality practiced in joy with the view to the fulfillment of being, gradually gave way to a closed, morose, repressed sexuality. Bourdieu's intervention opened the door for others to express nostalgia for those pre-colonial times in which Muslim societies were still sexually open and facilitated and did not hinder desire and jouissance. In 1990, Jamal Jum'a, who was an Iraqi poet who emigrated to Denmark in the 1980s, produced the first scholarly edition of An-Nafzawi's Garden. I'd mentioned it previously, and published in London. In his introduction to the edition, Jum'a complains that the garden, and I quote him, is known to almost every Western reader at a rate equal to the ignorance under which it languages in Arab cultural circles. And to return one last time to the Islamic paradise, there are now a number of Arab philosophers, psychoanalysts, and scholars of literature who write about the Islamic paradise, expressing appreciation of its sensualism. In 1995, and this is my last quote, Aziz al-Azmeh, he's a Syrian philosopher and historian who now teaches at the Central European University. In 1995, al-Azmeh published an essay entitled Rhetoric for the Senses, in which he describes traditional Muslim paradise literature as a literature that, I quote, imagines the unimaginable, delights in beholding it, and glorifies the possibility of possessing it, and endlessly repeating its possession and enjoyment, which is endless because the desire is endless. So without, going into a deep analysis of this quote, in a way, I think we've returned to the beginning of my talk. In Al-Azmeh's essay, we see a reappearance of Gros Richard's psychoanalytical concerns, jouissance, an idea which he inherits from Lacan, who wrote about jouissance, and desire. Desire being, and then I will stop, a function, according to Lacan, that is central to all human experience. And I would extend this quote to say that this is regardless of whether one looks at the question of the senses and of sensibility from a Western or an Eastern perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, grazie molte, questa relazione così interessante e originale, e direi che adesso possiamo passare alla discussione. Domande, commenti, osservazioni. Prego. No, dopo. No, era la sorpresa fazzoletto. Prego.
Thank you for your interesting. Well, just to mention an interesting Italian edition has been made by Roberta Denaro from Orientale, Italian edition on Mille e una notte, no? But just a short remark. Now, I'd like to ask you if there recently new researchers to carry on this research on Orientalism. I would just mention one example made by we already discussed about André Gingrich. He wrote an interesting text on frontier Orientalism. So he tried to applicate the paradigm of Orientalism to other forms of Orientalism, and he called it frontier Orientalism, and started from the experience of the siege of Vienna, and compared it with a similar situation in the 80s of the last century, so of the 1980s, when the Austrian president Kurt Waldheim was defended by Austrians, like the Austrians had been argumenting against Turks after the besiege in the 17th century. So this is one example of applicating this paradigm of Orientalism even to new analysis. Do you know of other types of trying to develop this kind of research?
Yes. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know Gingrich's book, but I will look it up. It sounds very interesting. Just a comment on this idea that Orientalism is especially pervasive in times of immediate conflict. That seems to be the idea. So when there's a clash, when the Turks are, besieging Vienna, then Orientalist stereotypes come up. That's, I think, very true and could help to kind of qualify and nuance Said's account a little bit. One context in which I've noticed this myself is the Crusades. When the Europeans first go to do their crusade in the Holy Land, they are very successful. They conquer Jerusalem. And they are actually quite interested in Oriental and Islamic culture. It's only when, the Arabs, and then later under the leadership of Saladin, hit back that the picture completely changes, that you get all these negative representations. So I think that would be a very useful way to contextualize this broader idea of Orientalism. Said's book has come under a lot of criticism. He's still considered, I think, one of the founder, maybe the founder of post-colonial studies, and nothing is going to take that away from him. But within Middle Eastern and Islamic studies, a lot of people have actually started to talk back to him and point out, for example, that he ignores a lot of the evidence, that there are many 19th century Orientalists who cannot really be connected to any imperialist or colonial agenda. He talks about the French and English scholars mostly. He says very little about German Orientalism, which also was a very strong tradition in the 19th century, but there was no direct colonial interest for the Germans. So their interest cannot be connected to the interest in colonial domination. So there are these rejoinders. There's also a translator of the Arabian Nights called Robert Irwin, who is very anti-Said and who points out that many also of the English Orientalists were really driven by curiosity, etc., etc. And the other problem with Said, and this is something that anthropologists, I think, have often pointed out, and which resurfaces in my talk, is that he talks about, the Western misrepresentations of the Orient, but he never gives us any clues as to what a true or authentic representation of the Orient might look like. So it's a project in criticism. He's destroying, deconstructing a discourse, but he doesn't give us any alternative, positive story. One final thing I mentioned, because it connects to the talk and is very interesting, is the application of Said's ideas to art history, in art history. So many of the images that I showed you actually come from this angle. Jérôme has been a very prominent, target of post-Orientalist criticism. There's a wonderful article by an art historian called Linda Nochlin, which looks at the paintings of Jérôme and Ingres and others, and also the Delacroix painting that I showed you. So it's been very fruitfully used in the history of art, critical history of art as well. But my own sense is that it's not as if we have overcome Edward Said and do no longer pay attention to him. We still pay a lot of attention to him, but we've nuanced his generalizations quite a bit. Yeah. And much more could be said about Edward Said, who was a very a very great scholar, of course, originally a scholar of comparative literature, who then totally got sucked into this Orientalism debate. It was also very much politically active in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, collaborated with Daniel Barenboim, the Jewish conductor who had an orchestra in the occupied territories called the West Eastern Orchestra or something, and Said was very much in conversation with him. Anyway, but yeah, he remains a bit of a bête noire in Islamic studies and Middle Eastern studies, because he really gave us a shock. But I guess Middle Eastern studies deserve to be challenged and shocked. So it's all good as far as I'm concerned. And now we have people like Joseph Massad, who are starting to also look at it from the other side. I'm trying to do this in my own work as well. So I'm optimistic that we've learned a lesson and that there's a future. Yeah.
Christian, thanks a lot. I can also say I have many questions for you.
Let me get a pen.
And no. I'll restrict myself to one question, which is kind of the obvious philosopher's question that concerns the notion of sensualism. Mm-hmm. So you've been showing an interesting constellation in which the sensualism could be used as a critical term in a symmetrical way. So both the West describing the Arab world as over-sensualist and also vice versa. So these quotes you gave us about Paris. Mm. And there already you see some different associations. So you have this overindulgence in sensual pleasures, but also on the other side, the materialist connotations of sensualism, which is a typical connotation you have in European, even academic philosophy, where sensualism and materialism become paired in 19th century philosophy. But the interesting thing about these symmetrical situations, which you find time and again in intellectual history, is that they, in any case, show that the topic becomes more and more prominent in different contexts, and that's also what you ended up with in a way. So what I would find interesting is what in the end is happening with this charge of sensualism. So in which context can you really make use of it? And one figure I'm thinking of, and that's for me the figure via whom I came acquainted with these ways of reading the Knights, that's Pasolini. Mm-hmm. Of course, who has been famously using both the Knights and Boccaccio and Balzac as a way of making sensualism visible with, in a kind of radical Marxist, left-wing, simple life directed intention. So the interesting thing is, so with this complex history of sensualism and the various instrumentalizations of sensualism in philosophy, where does it get us? What kind of critical potential does it develop beyond criticizing the other, symmetrically criticizing the other? Mm-hmm. And perhaps a related issue at the end, you've been referring to desire. Mm-hmm. But that seems to be a term that works on a different level compared to the senses. Mm-hmm. So you strongly refer to the senses as the five bodily senses, but desire seems to be a more complex or involving the soul, in a sense different from the quote you gave concept. So that would also be interesting to link up these two terms for me.
Yes. So, desire and jouissance, I guess jouissance is also can also be intellectual or not directly connected to the body. And that
That's
is,
typically discovered with mid-19th century philosophers to investigate the higher pleasures more and more. So it all comes together in this period, interestingly.
yeah. Well, with the Arab writers, I see this only in the second half of the 20th century. And it's true that someone like Aziz al-Azmi is not only talking about the bodily pleasures and jouissance in that sense. He's very explicitly also pointing out that, in this case, in descriptions of the Muslim paradise, there are visual pleasures. The highest pleasure, and this is in the traditional literature, the highest pleasure in the Muslim paradise is always the vision of God, the visio beatifica. So it's a combination, and that deserves to be emphasized very much. And yes, the other point is also very well taken. I think totally correct. At what point does sensualism become a problem, and for whom? Studying the Muslim paradise traditions, I've kind of always, when I talk about it now, I tend to ask a question back to the audience. Why is this a problem to begin with? So who came up with the idea that the afterlife or the highest imaginable pleasure should only be spiritual? Why aren't bodies resurrected in the Christian paradise? So according to most, there are some exceptions, of course. So it's a question that the issue is one that invites us to ask questions about our own tradition, maybe even more than about tradition of Muslims. Yeah, and sensualism and materialism. Yes, thank you for pointing that one out too. It's not the same thing, obviously. There are interesting critiques in 19th and 20th century Middle Eastern thinking about Western culture, which are more about the materialism than about the sensualism. So in medical literature, for example, I know this from someone who studied this tradition in our department in Utrecht. Of course, Western medicine was received and then taught, but there were also voices that said this is too materialist. They are forgetting about the inner life of our patients, and that's something that's lacking in Western Schulmedizin, in the traditional West or the modern Western way of treating patients. So materialism has a slightly different inflection in the exchange. Yeah, thank you.
Anche l'italiano.
Sì,
lui
perché no?
capisce.
Anche meglio se non dico cose strane.
Se io non ho capito, lei va a tradurre.
Sì, sì. Innanzitutto grazie per l'intervento perché è molto interessante. No, diciamo era solo un'osservazione storica antica, perché ho notato che nell'introduzione all'Alexander the Großen di Droysen, lui insisteva molto su questo fatto che l'Asia avesse un desiderio verso l'Europa, perché l'Europa era la patria della libertà, della democrazia, e viceversa l'Europa aveva questo desiderio dell'Asia perché era questo popolo spirituale che andava molto sui sensi, sul sentimento. Quindi c'era questo connubio di ragione e sentimento, diciamo così, e quindi Alessandro poi risolveva questo dissidio tra i due popoli, diciamo. Quindi era questa la riflessione.
Traduco.
Sì, grazie.
I think I got the gist of it. So you were asking about the European fascination about the East as offering spirituality in combination with sensibility and sensualism.
By quoting
the biography of
and Alexander.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure Paul Ziche will know everything about him, but I suspect he fits into a romantic tradition.
Yes.
Droysen?
Droysen is 1833, the publication of Alexander the Großen.
Yes. So I think this is part of a group of people in European thought who discovered that European thinking was maybe, distancing itself too much from the spiritual resources that then were located in the East. Some of the Romantic era philosophers that Paul works on wrote books about the wisdom of the Brahmins. And who was die Weisheit der Brahmanen? Huh? Rückert, oh yeah. And also later after Schelling there were other like Schlegel and so on. Yeah, so this fits, I guess, into a time when maybe the issue of materialism in European society became a problem, and then, but it's the opposite picture of what I presented in a way, because I was talking about these Orientalist ideas that the East is only sensual and not spiritual. But you have the exact, yeah, in a sense, you have the other case as well, which only proves the point that these were fantasies, I think. Mm-hmm. So whatever you felt is lacking at home, you project it to the East. Yeah.
No,
l'ho interrotto solo per tradurre, ma se vuoi...
No, era questo, diciamo, il senso, cioè, che era il contrario, nel senso che appunto c'era questa visione della razionalità europea che però ovviamente è mediata da Droysen, che appunto nel romanticismo aveva questa forte idea anche tedesca sostanzialmente della razionalità europea, quindi non è tanto una percezione asiatica, è più che altro una idea che Droysen ha dell'Asia nei confronti soprattutto della filosofia greca, perché lui si sposta sul personaggio di Alessandro dandogli delle qualità che diciamo sono proprie del romanticismo tedesco e anche della filosofia hegeliana, nella misura in cui Alessandro è diciamo l'agente della ragione della storia, della razza della storia, e quindi sostanzialmente gli dà tutte queste prerogative verso l'Asia, ma diciamo la visione asiatica è più una visione europea e tedesca del fatto che appunto gli asiatici pensassero a una libertà, ad emanciparsi, e quindi Alessandro in qualche modo anticipa il decolonialismo sostanzialmente, che poi storicamente si è verificato, ecco.
Just one other comment on this. So now we're talking about German Orientalism, which may be a different animal. So the emphasis there is different. And it's no coincidence, I suppose, that Said doesn't talk about this tradition in his book, because he's primarily concerned with the English and the French writing ideologues of colonization. So I don't want to overemphasize, and I don't mean to say that the Germans were doing well and the French and the English were doing bad things. Not at all. But there are local differences, and also these were people, historians and philosophers, so they were looking perhaps with a slightly different lens.
Forse perché i tedeschi non hanno un colonialismo in Asia, cioè non hanno colonie effettivamente in Asia, ne hanno solo qualcune in Africa, mentre diciamo gli inglesi e i francesi hanno più un diretto contatto con questi popoli, quindi forse anche questo, diciamo.
Yeah. Thank you.
Grazie, molto interessante. Appunto, sì, anche allargare il discorso per cercare di, come dire, coprire i temi è molto utile. Prego. Facciamo parlare prima lo studente? Prego. Sì, poi dopo passo.
This is like a therapy session,
Okay, well, I will try to imagine what I'm thinking, because I still don't know. So, but I want to ask you. Well, okay, as a part, also Mezzogiorno in Italy was part of Orientalism, as some scholars underline. And so, totally maybe a part of this, of your lecture, as a part of city was strongly orientalized and maybe still is orientalized by other people, other also European people in this moment. I am asking if there is a jouissance, there is a pleasure inside in orientalizing in itself.
Yes.
Maybe in this kind. I don't know if the question is.
Yeah, no, it's very well put, and I think this is precisely Paul Richard's point. It's not only about the jouissance of the Sultan; it's about the jouissance of the Europeans reading about the Sultan. It's both. So yeah, I don't think, and in that sense, Gori-Shar is much less political than Said. Said only wants to talk about issues of power, and he's a Foucauldian thinker. Whereas Gori-Shar, without celebrating the fantasy, admits that there is a jouissance in fantasizing. Yeah.
Also because it's something you're not allowed to do in Europe. So you create this alternative world where you can finally enjoy.
Yeah, and I and Paul were talking about how beautiful Naples is and how much we like it. We are fantasizing about Naples as a kind of, Oriental Oriental city.
Strongly influenced by romanticist ideas.
Yes,
but also Neapolitans are always fantasizing about the way other people see Naples.
But for them it's a problem, I guess, or
No. So it seems like maybe the notion of big other in Lacan could be good, because also Napolitan imagine how other people imagine the city, and so there is really this strange, loop of fantasizing.
Just a matter of desire.
A loop of fantasizing. Yeah, I suppose that do the people of Napoli also have their own fantasies about northern Italy or the north of Europe? Yes. Yeah, there's also Occidentalism.
Neapolitanism. Prego. Your turn.
Thank you for the talk. It was very stimulating. I have a number of questions. I will try to put two questions in a few words. The first one is, should we regard the Islamic world as a monoblock, a unity, or is it worth to distinguish between different Islamic cultures, Arabs and Turks and Iranians and Northern Africans and Indians and so on? The second question is, when we talk about erotic literature in any country, do you think it is strictly, I do think, do you share that it is strictly linked to the conception of the role of women in society, and it is generally expression of a sexophobic attitude whereby women are just sexual objects? I was much stricken by the quotation of abridged editions for decent women.
Yeah. The first question is a major one. You have a habit of asking big questions, which is great. It's a problem that in Islamic studies we discuss as the problem of unity and diversity of the Islamic world. Traditionally, in Orientalism, there was an idea that it's possible to define the one pure Islam by going back to the sources of Islamic culture, the Arab Peninsula, the Quran, the Prophet. This is a paradigm that we've really left behind. So now we make much more distinctions between different regions of the Islamic world, such as the Persian-speaking world, which is now defined in terms of Balkan to Bengal, because the entire territory from the Balkans to Bengal in the later centuries was under the sway of Persian culture and Turkish culture to an extent, but had quite really little to do with the Arab context in which Islam was born. And even the Quran didn't really have that much importance, if I may say so. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Persian speakers refer to the Masnavi of Rumi, the Sufi poet, as the Persian Quran. So there's great variety, and then the question is whether then we should speak of Islams in the plural, or whether there still is a coherent concept that we can refer to as the Islam. And anthropologists generally will say, no, we can only speak of Islams. But scholars of Islamic studies will try to defend the idea that there is something that keeps the Islamic world together as a singular concept. Most famously, some 5 years ago, a professor at Harvard University, Shahab Ahmed, wrote a book with the title, What is Islam?, in which he defended the idea that there still is coherence. And one of the stories that he gives, which is nice, I think, is that a friend of his from Pakistan got married to a man, so a woman friend of his from Pakistan gets married to a Moroccan Muslim. And the parents now have to meet. And both the daughter and the son, they are in total panic because they think, well, they can't talk to each other. In Pakistan they speak Urdu, in Morocco they speak Arabic. So there's this awkward phone call between the parents, and then afterwards both the daughter and the son ask their parents, so how did it go? And the answer is, oh yeah, we got along fine because we're Muslims after all. We have this shared tradition of Islam. So it's just a story to illustrate that you can argue that there is a single concept of Islam, but if you're an anthropologist, most likely you will say, we can only talk about Islams, and then you emphasize the differences between the Persians, who allow, for example, for depictions of the Prophet or figurative arts, while the Arabs have more of a problem with it. Or you can make big distinctions between Moroccans and Egyptians. The Moroccans think they are somehow more spiritual because there's a lot of Sufism in Morocco, and the Egyptians are kind of Sayyid Qutb kind of people, whatever, But there's also the danger, if you emphasize the plurality of Islams, obviously the danger of creating artificial distinctions. So both the plural and the singular, I would say, have problems. And I hope this answers at least some aspects of your question. I would have more things to say, but your other question was about, remind me. Oh yes, yeah. So one thing that I was thinking was there's also, yes, I suppose the erotica tradition will always reflect how gender is organized and disciplined in a society. So in a patriarchal society, you will probably have erotica literature that tends to denigrate women. But I suppose there's also erotic literature written by women and for women. So I suppose the question then is, if you look at a text like The Garden of this Tunisian author, An-Nafzawi, you have to look at every text and see to what extent these relations of power between the gender are reproduced in the text. In the case of The Garden, I think it's quite clearly phallocentric. There's a lot of chapters on the male genitalia, but the notion that women have a right to be satisfied is also very much present. So it's complicated. It's not just men objectifying women. There's a lot of that going on as well. But there are also these elements of, thinking about sex in this case as a relationship of equals. I don't know. And probably even within the Arab erotica tradition, you have differences. And one author will emphasize, like Ibn Hazm, who's the author of The Ring of the Dove, has a very different view of women than An-Nafzawi.
Yes, please.
First of all, many thanks for the paper. It was really fascinating.
Thank you.
Now, going back again to, you were just mentioning the Ring of Dove. So I have a question regarding that. It's more like, I'm curious if you could expand a bit on it, because you mentioned that it is set in a context that deals a lot more with love theory, and he engages a lot with philosophy. You mentioned Platonism in a sense, and also, so it also deals with the importance of sight, which is something that I think is a lot present in Platonic dialogues. I think about, for example, the Symposium, where the importance of sight is not only linked to the idea of seeing the forms in the sense of grasping the forms, but I mean, in an Islamic context, could this not be linked to the Quran? So to the idea of not grasping Platonic forms, of course, but grasping God. And so in particular, I was curious to know what are the sources for the philosophy that underlies the Ring of the Dove, because of course I know that in Arabic tradition they were reading Plotinus and Aristotle, but were they reading directly, for example, Plato's Symposium? So very broadly, if you could expand on this.
I love that question. It opens up all kinds of possibilities to talk a lot. So first of all, Ibn Hazm, what he has is the story of men and women finding each other as the two halves of a sphere.
Okay.
Which dialogue? This is in Symposium, right? So he must have known about it, but I don't know in what the channels of transmission were exactly. It's true that it's generally thought that Aristotle was received and translated into Arabic, and then you get Averroes and the commentators and so on. But at least Ibn Hazm must have known this text. The question of the ratio and the hierarchy of the senses is very interesting to me, because this is another Orientalist cliche that I didn't talk about so much. I was going to, but then I thought I don't have enough time. So now I can talk about it. The idea that, and this goes back to Marshall McLuhan, who's a media theorist who wrote this book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, and who said that modern Western modernity has to do with the primacy given to the eye. He even talks about ocular centrism of modern Western culture. And he makes a very grandiose claim by saying that this is specific to Western civilization. African and Oriental cultures emphasize hearing. It talks about a great divide, a grand or great divide is his phrase, between the West and the East along these lines. This is how more than 5 years ago, I started with the question of the senses in Islam, because I thought this is ridiculous. As you say in the Quran, there's a lot about seeing the miracles of God in nature, the ayat, which is an interesting pun, because the verse in the Quran is, the Arabic word is ayah, but ayah is also the word for the sign that you see in nature. So both the verses that you read with your eyes and the natural phenomena are ayat. So there's a lot of emphasis on vision, seeing. There's also, however, a lot of emphasis on listening. And the Quran itself, as you know, is to be recited. The meaning of the Arabic word Quran is recitation. So a lot of scholarship has talked about the oral acoustic experience of the Quran. That's been emphasized. But I think you have a very good point by saying that the Quran is also very heavily invested in sight, which comes first in the Aristotelian hierarchy of the five senses, of course, and from where it also goes to Ibn Hazm, I suppose. But it's definitely not true that in all Muslim contexts, this hierarchy of the senses was somehow reversed. Hearing didn't come first. Hearing came first for some people, probably. Those who were interested in recitation of the Quran and in oral instruction, oral transmission of religious knowledge. In these contexts, you often find people saying, we need to train our ears. We need to train ourselves to listen, and not so much seeing and studying nature, but simply, receiving the transmitted knowledge from others. So Ibn Hazm, he's one of the authors that emphasizes vision. You're quite right. And is he an exception? I don't think so. I hope that goes some way to answer. You were talking about other things as well, which were interesting.
This was the main one, and so a little follow-up on that. Do you think that when a thinker emphasizes more vision rather than hearing, is it like for political agendas linked to the role Islamic religion had within the context, the Islamic context, I don't know, the political power or so?
Well, I mean, it can be easily hijacked as an argument to denigrate Islam.
Okay.
If you say that Islam is against sight, you know, that is very easily linked into the idea that Islam is a tradition that forbids you to look at a lot of things. Women have to veil, you're not allowed to look at images, it's anti-iconic, anti-figurative, etc. So it's very easy to use this argument in a manipulative way to talk badly about Islam. And then you kind of grant that, okay, Muslims are mostly auditive, oral people, but they don't allow vision. So that it has huge political implications, I think. And I think I'm afraid this is also how McLuhan kind of conceptualized it. He thought that scientific modernity was only possible if you have an ocular-centric regime, because that gives you distance, you know, it's more objective, you look at objects from afar. Whereas if you touch or let alone smell or taste something, you know, it's too immediate. You don't have the kind of rigorous objective approach that is required. Paul wants to come in on this. But yeah, I mean, I think I hope I'm not misreading McLuhan or misrepresenting him, but for him, in any case, Western modernity is intimately linked to the eye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Altre domande da parte tua? Oh, you also have a question, Paul, please go ahead.
Yeah, just briefly, but it's not a question, but that's now opening up a hugely interesting discourse, because we have all sorts of changing hierarchies among the senses throughout the history of philosophical psychology and anthropology, also in the West. So there are clearly authors who privilege sight because it's distance, it's also directed, but you can also privilege hearing because it's also on a distance but omnidirectional.
Yes.
You have touch, which gets you closer to the real things themselves, which might also give it a privilege if you think in empiricist terms. You hardly ever, to my knowledge, have smell and taste indeed as fundamental senses, but hearing, touch, and sight, for all of them you have good arguments. It's also interesting to think of biblical context, because sometimes, so Thomas, he needs to touch.
Yes.
And you also have to taste God's grace in Christian. Christian tradition is interesting because basically it's multisensorial.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting to see that philosophical anthropology is always trying to clear up this multisensorial regime we have in quite some religious contexts.
Yeah. It's hugely interesting to me. In Islamic theology, you don't touch God and you're not touched by God.
Yeah.
This is something the Christians do.
You have that with the Hurwis, untouched. So in a
way, there are lots of touching rituals, of course.
Yeah.
So when people go to Mecca in the pilgrimage, you know, what they do is they rob the Kaaba. Yeah. When they go to visit saints in their graves, they touch the graves. And there are even occasionally stories about God actually touching the prophet. So there's one hadith, one narrative about the prophet, where the prophet is during his ascension. There's a story that he goes up to the heavens and has an entretien, tête-à-tête with God. God puts his hand on the prophet's shoulder, and the prophet comes back and then touches his followers. So there's an indirect touch by God. Yeah. Stories about pious people traveling to his grave in Medina and then standing in front of the grave, and then suddenly the prophet puts out a hand from the grave and shakes hands with
that all sounds pretty plausible from Christian traditions too.
Yes. But yes, feeling, 19th century, right? Feeling is not visual. Feeling is maybe hearing based, but mostly touch based, I guess. I know this is simplifying things a great deal, but
Feeling is a great term
Fühlen.
because, yeah, of course, it's related to touch, but it's also a kind of abstract term covering all sorts of sensory. I have a feeling that it's going to rain tomorrow. That
Yeah.
is based upon sensory input, but it's also a kind of epistemic disclaimer
or figurative use.
or figurative use.
Yeah.
So, okay, normally it would be related to touch, but that's typically 1800 discourse, that you have at least some terms being generalized or over-generalized, starting from pretty concrete origins,
Anyway, we can't
metaphoricized.
Yeah, we can't escape the senses, and we can't escape smell either. I mean, sometimes you see remnants of this in German. When you want to say I can't stand someone, you say I can't smell him. Ich kann ihn nicht riechen.
I'm smelling a rat.
Yeah, I smell a rat. Exactly. Phenomenologists have. I like this very much. Of course, there are French phenomenologists who. Yeah. Mauro.
So here as a transform become. Thank you. I have many questions, but we don't have much time. So a general one and then a more specific one. The general one is when I consider the third part of your talk, it seems to me that more or less there is an agreement between the Arab thinkers you were mentioning and the Orientalist Al-Said. The only difference being that what from the Occidental perspective seems to be a problem, from their perspective seems to be a good point. So I mean, the idea is that there is really a division between hyper-rational civilization as opposed to something which is more sensualist, if you want it. But this is not anymore a problem because that is the right approach to the body. So in a way, it seems to be, yes, that account is correct. But you know what? All the negative prejudices which were implied, these are wrong. So, which is fine which is interesting because then in a way it mirrors the problems that we are facing now. Because if you look at the debate on what is the Western civilization and the heritage of the philosophical Christian tradition, and now, especially if you look at the philosophical debates, now the point is that you need to change this perspective, which is just reason and spirit, and you also need to consider the body and the material and the matter. So it looks like it's the same. Yes, that account is correct, but not anymore. That doesn't mean anything at all. Or if it means anything at all, it is that the Western society has a problem with the body, and not the Oriental society.
That's what.
And which means that, by the way, that you should at some point mention what you were very, brilliantly bypassing, which is the problem of Christianism, because it looks like the problem begins there. And more specifically, you were observing and you were making us observe that all the naked women are white. And this tells us also something about the problems with the body in the Western tradition, because they were always representing the male bodies as dark or black, which is historically correct. And then, I don't know why, white woman. So in a way, that is already interesting. But there was the translation of the garden, the Arabic translation.
Edition, you mean?
Edition, the one you were showing us. And that's surprising. I don't know, I was curious about the book because you were showing us 3 covers, 2 Western translations, and there were, of course, a white naked woman. And then there was the Arabic one, and there as well there was the white woman, and that was, why? The same cover.
Yes.
I don't know, why should an Arabic translation have a white woman?
You mean this one?
Yes.
Yeah. I think because this happens because they too are caught in this Orientalist tradition. They can't think outside of it. It's a bit like, sorry to say so, but put the Instituto putting up the image of of the. We were talking about this, so I hope I'm not overstepping bounds here, but an image on your website that also comes out of an Orientalist tradition. We are just not able to think outside of the box, it seems. I don't know.
We are starting.
We're starting maybe, but you're absolutely right that from the Arab, these authors that I talked about towards the end, from their perspective, so Bourdiba and Juma and Azme, they don't have a problem.
Yes.
Yeah, those poor Christians have a problem.
Yeah, they just accept the divide.
But that also is a kind of polemical argument. You could say that blinds them to some of the issues and real problems in a text like the one by Anna Fleury.
There's a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's great. So here we are. We have this liberated tradition, and maybe there were some stupid Salafis and reformers in the 19th century, but we've overcome this problem because now we're in post-colonial time. So it's quite easy and facile.
No, yes. The follow-up question was whether these thinkers you were mentioning, where they were trained, because it is interesting to see whether they were grasping these ideas in the, let's say, Occidental debates on the growing importance given to the body, or if they were, so in the way they were learning in the Western debates how to contrast the stereotype, or if this really comes from the Arabic world. I don't know. This is just a curiosity.
Yeah, well, I don't know enough about their psychological situation, but I mean, it's worth mentioning that both these people operate in Western contexts. So Juma in Denmark, and Al-Azme is a professor
This is my point.
At the European University, and also Bourdiba, by the way, Sorbonne educated.
And that is my point, that they were learning there all these problems about the body. Va bene. Sono quasi le 6, quindi direi che anche oggi è stata una discussione veramente interessante. Grazie soprattutto a voi, che ci vuole un po' per caricarvi, ma poi fate delle domande interessantissime, in generale per tutti gli altri che hanno partecipato al dibattito, ma soprattutto penso a Christian, che ha dato veramente un'interpretazione originale del problema tra Oriente e Occidente. Grazie ancora. Ci vediamo domani sempre alle 4 per continuare il nostro percorso. A presto, arrivederci.